Thanks. Thank you for jumping in to the people who are just now joining the Zoom. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes and get started about 2 minutes after the hour. Just want to make sure folks have enough time to join. Thank you to the folks who are just now jumping in. We're just going to give it another minute or so, and then we will go ahead and get started. All right, I think we can probably go ahead and get going here. Let me go ahead and start recording.
Recording in progress.
Great. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's briefing. My name is Will Soltero, and I'm the press secretary at Secure Democracy Foundation. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3 organization. We're so excited that you've all joined us today for a roundtable discussion on the rigorous checks and balances election officials will go through to ensure that we have a free and fair election in North Carolina this year. This discussion will focus mostly on the post-election process, including ballot verification and counting, canvassing, and certification. We'll also touch briefly on the work North Carolina election officials are doing in the wake of Hurricane Helene. Before I introduce our panelists and start our discussion, I want to go over just a couple of logistical items. First, this event is for members of the media only. If you are not a journalist but would like more information on the issues that we're discussing today, or if you'd like to speak to a member of our team, please contact us at press@securedemocracyusa.org. Second, after today's discussion, the panelists will be available to answer questions. If you have any questions during today's discussion, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will try to get to them. Finally, I also want to let you know that after our call today, we will be following up with materials outlining the post-election process in North Carolina and can connect you to any of today's speakers. With that, let's go ahead and get started and introduce you to our panelists. First, we have Karen Brinson Bell, who is the Executive Director for the North Carolina State Board of Elections. She served in that role since 2019 and is in charge with overseeing the state's 100 county election boards. We're also excited to be joined by Sarah Levere, who's the Brunswick County Board of Elections Director and President of the North Carolina Association of Directors of Elections. She served in the Brunswick County Board of Elections since 2006, first as Deputy Director, and assumed her current role in 2014. And lastly, we have Chandra Scott, who is Policy Director for Secure Democracy Foundation. Chandra is based in North Carolina and has worked on elections in both Carolinas throughout her career. All right, with that, I'd love to come to you first, Karen. We're here first and foremost to talk about the checks and balances that we see in the post-election process. But before we get into that, I'd like to give you a chance to talk about some of the changes North Carolinians will see after Hurricane Helene. Can you walk us through how the State Board of Elections, local election boards, and the legislature have responded to the devastation of the hurricane in the western part of the state? Really, what are the most important things voters should know, and what are the most important changes that we'll see?
Thanks, Will, and thanks for doing this today. And thanks to the members of the media for helping us get accurate information out to the voters of North Carolina and across the nation. In terms of Hurricane Helene, I think the most important thing everyone needs to know is voting is open in North Carolina in all 100 counties. And I know there were many who doubted that that would be possible when Hurricane Helene caused such devastation at the end of September. But on that Monday, immediately following the storms hit to Western North Carolina, we had 14 of our County Board of Elections in that region that could not open. And we worked hand in hand with our North Carolina Emergency Management, National Guard, other local, state, and federal partners to get them back online. And 1 week later, when the state board met to take emergency actions that could be give flexibility in the conduct of elections for those 13 counties, most affected counties, all county boards of elections were open by that point. So to have that kind of response time, I think, is just a real testament to the preparations that election officials put into the conduct of elections so that when emergencies do happen, we can pivot and be responsive. It's meant building out strong working relationships for years now with all of those individuals so that we have an all hazards approach to making sure that voting continues. We have said many times before, we don't stop an election, we figure out how to proceed. And so on that particular Monday, the state board passed a resolution under their emergency authorities that allowed for the counties in the 13 most affected counties to have flexibility in reassigning poll workers from other parts of the county to other precincts. They could invite county registered voters from other counties in to work if need be. They could readjust where the polling locations would be. They could merge precincts if necessary. They gave them flexibility in the early voting sites because early voting plans had already been adopted and we were very close to starting early voting. And so there were a lot of things in those ways. There were many other aspects that were put in place, but at the end of the day, the reality was, or the real push was to make sure there was flexibility. A few days later, the legislature came in and they not only adopted many of the provisions that the state board, actually most of the provisions that the state board had put into that emergency resolution, they expanded that to the 25 counties that had been designated in the federal disaster declaration. In the state board's resolution, it was a unanimous vote, bipartisan officials, and in the legislature, it was unanimous and then signed into law by our governor. So I think it just demonstrates a complete commitment by everyone to make sure that voting could continue. And what we've been able to do since then is we have opened early voting. That took place last Thursday, and we had early voting start that day in all 100 counties. In the Helene affected area, we had 80 early voting sites planned in those 25 counties, and we were able to open 76. And remarkably, we didn't anticipate having power to all 76, and we did because of the hard work of the power companies and all those line personnel who made that possible. Since then, we have seen tremendous turnout, record turnout across the state and in many of those Helene affected counties. As we approach election day, they have had to exercise some of the provisions in that resolution and in the Relief Act, but ultimately, the vast majority of our election day sites will be open across the state and certainly in those Helene affected counties. Just last week, we anticipated that we would be needing approximately 13 blank slate tents to be sourced by North Carolina Emergency Management to put in place of sites that may have been affected, had damage from the flood or other issues with Helene. Or they might have been polling places that were being used for disaster relief. But we've come so far in such a short amount of time that we actually are now looking at just 5 tents that need to be set up. So I think it's just a testament to the dedication, the hard work, the resiliency of our election officials, of the community, and really of all of those supporting the disaster response. And so we just really encourage everyone, if you need specific information about Helene and some of the voting options that we have for those voters, particularly in how they can return their absentee by mail ballot, an affected voter or their near relative can return their ballot, an absentee by mail ballot, to another county board of elections anywhere in the state or an early voting site anywhere in the state. That's only effective for those counties or for those voters in those affected counties. The details of this information are on the Helene website that we set up immediately following the storm hitting the western part of the state. That website is ncsbe.gov/Helene. But with all voters, we encourage you to plan your vote, check your voter registration, know where polling locations are located, and what your options are. Get a sample ballot and learn about the photo ID requirements that are in place in North Carolina by going to ncsbe.gov. That's our state board website, or to your county board website that'll have local information.
Thank you so much for that, Karen, and thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and continuing to do to make sure that all North Carolinians can vote this year. I think now I'd like to fast forward and turn our attention to the post-election period and turn things over to you, Chandra, to start us off. Chandra, can you briefly walk us through the checks and balances we see once polls close in North Carolina? What should we expect to see as officials count, canvass, and certify the results?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Will, for this question. And actually, I think before we can talk about what happens after the polls close, we should cover the checks and balances that ensure we have a fair and free election before Election Day as well. So that includes verifying voters' identity when they register to vote and when they request an absentee ballot. Also, before Election Day, election officials in North Carolina are required by law to test all voting equipment in a process that is fully open to the public. It is important to remember that North Carolina requires county election boards to begin verifying and processing absentee ballots 5 weeks before Election Day. And that just helps poll workers be able to tabulate those ballots as soon as polls close on Election Day. Now that we've established that base, let's talk about what happens when the polls close. Once the polls close on Election Day, election officials immediately begin to tabulate the votes. This process continues without stopping until all the votes are tabulated. Multiple poll workers are involved in tabulating ballots, and election officials will intentionally pair poll workers from both parties as well as independents to conduct these counts in a process that's fully open to observers. So fully open, fully staffed with participants as far as it comes to these counts. In regards to the canvass, which comes right after that, this is when county boards determine votes have been counted correctly for all races before transmitting results to the State Board of Election for a similar review. So it happens at the county level and at the state. During that canvass, county boards examine returns from all precincts, review provisional ballots, and conduct audits to verify the accuracy of the count, all in meetings that are open to the public. I want to stress that these meetings are always open to the public. At this stage, the state board also randomly picks 2 precincts in each county where the top race is hand counted on paper ballots. This sample hand-to-eye count is then compared to the results from tabulation machines to ensure accuracy and discrepancies are investigated. So there are checks and balances every step of the way. Right after the canvass, we are immediately moving on to certification. While local election officials can clear up discrepancies in the results presented to them during canvass, they must by law certify the results at this stage. County boards are responsible for certifying the races at the county level, such as those for school board, for example. And while the State Board of Elections certifies races at the state level, such as those for governor or president. So as you can see, there are many checks and balances from pre-election, polls closing, post-election, all the way to certifications. And we can feel really, really confident in our elections here in North Carolina.
I think it's so valuable to kind of have you walk through it step by step, Chandra. Even just giving like a high level view like that is fantastic. Thank you so much. Sarah, I'd love to come to you next, and I'd love to drill down kind of on that first step on the counting and tabulation and how that works at the local and county level. So when you start the counting process, can you tell us kind of who's involved in counting ballots, what kind of checks and balances you have at that stage? And on top of that, maybe how does this process maybe look different now compared to 2020?
Certainly, that is a great question. So I think it's important that everybody knows that in North Carolina, we are taking steps to count ballots much earlier than Election Day. So when we started having absentee ballot meetings 5 weeks before the election, our bipartisan board members are reviewing absentee ballots. County boards of elections are allowed to take preparatory steps to open those ballots, remove the remove the ballots from the envelope, scan them in, and just close the tabulator, secure the ballots, so that we're not having to scan all those in election day. I think that's fantastic. I'm really glad we have that capability. During those meetings, we're doing audits. So auditing is always part of our process. So if we have a record of accepting 100 ballots, the board approving 100 ballots, we make sure that the scanner scanned 100 ballots, and that's always happening. Same thing during early voting. So once early voting begins, as it has, the sites are accepting ballots every day. They're also taking those steps to reconcile and make sure that things balance. So if 100 voters checked in, we need to have 100 voter history records in the computer. We also need to have 100 ballots scanned on the machine. And so that's one way that we continuously are making sure that when we certify, we're certifying accurate results. On election day, that's when everybody thinks about tabulating. So that is the day that the board actually can take steps to extract the tally for each candidate from all of those votes that we've been working with along the way. 5:00 p.m. Our board, I think some boards are able to have those meetings earlier. So our board will meet, bipartisan participation, and they will close the absentee voting scanner. They will pull the results from that. The results go into an air gap system. I really think this is important. The computer that is tabulating the results that come from the voting machine has never touched the internet. It does not touch the internet. And so the election management system is tabulating the results. And then when we need to move that over to the state's election system, we're opening a brand new USB drive, and we are extracting those and putting them on that internet connected computer to the state's database. Each time we move those votes, we're doing an audit. So we bring someone in our office at 5:00, a fresh set of eyes that can look at numbers with us, because the rest of us have been at work since 5:30 in the morning. And once we get everything ready to go, we put it on an internal website where we can look at what it looks like for the public, and we can double check the numbers. And then it gets to go to the public results website, which is where everybody's looking for results and hitting refresh, refresh, refresh. The whole time we are in the supervision and in the presence of our bipartisan board members. So none of that is happening without their presence. Once the polls close, this is something that's different from 2020. Absentee by mail, we can have those results ready to go right at 7:30 when the polls close. Early voting machines, they can no longer be closed and the results pulled until the polls close. So at 7:30 p.m., our board has to supervise us closing those machines and getting the results. So early voting results are not going to be right at 7:30 when the polls close like they used to be. So that is different.
I think that is a really important note. I think that's also a question that everybody's going to have. Kind of, we all know ahead of time we're not going to have results right away, but then polls close, and I think all of us go back and we're like, okay, when are the results coming out? So I think really helpful to know, like, there will be this waiting period. That's right.
There is a waiting period. So waiting for the early voting results to be uploaded, that takes time. And then all of our precincts, however far they are from the county board office, once the location is closed down and everything, I mean, we have to leave it the way we found it. So we're taking down signs and all of that. The chief judges have to drive to our office. So for us, our furthest location is probably a 45-minute drive. So we can't get all of the results out until they get that data to us. And so we try to be as fast as we can, but sometimes it does take time, especially if they have a line at close. So anyone in line at 7:30 gets to check in and still vote. So it's not like 7:30, they get to start closing things down.
Right. That's a really good point, I think.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I do want to remind everybody who's here, if you have any questions for our panelists, we'll be moving into the Q&A portion soon. Feel free to just drop those into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Karen, I do want to come to you next because, of course, after results are reported and then canvassed, we do move to the certification stage, which we know has drawn a lot of attention nationally. Can you share a little bit more about North Carolina's laws on certification, the role that you play at the state board, and maybe even the steps that you've taken to address certification concerns in the past?
Sure. And Sarah did a great job of talking about how we get to results on election night. And I know she emphasized, and we always emphasize, election right results are unofficial. And we have a 10-day certification period in North Carolina. That's been our standard in our law for ages. And during that period, there are opportunities for other ballots to be considered. We could have a provisional ballot, a set of provisional ballots where someone presented themselves to vote and they were not on the registration rolls. And so in order to figure out why, did we have a misspelling in their name? Did the information not get sent over to us from the DMV? Various ways that we research to determine, are they an eligible voter and can we count that provisional ballot? Those go before the county board members. We've also implemented photo ID in North Carolina as of fall of 2023. This will be our largest election. If someone does not have an acceptable form of ID and did not bring that, maybe they have it, but they didn't bring it with them, or they need to complete the exception form, then they will vote a provisional ballot as well. So we're going to have a lot of provisional ballots that need to be considered. And in close contests, those could be game changers. We'll also, in North Carolina law, this is longstanding as well, military and overseas citizens are able to cast their ballot as long and have it counted if we receive it up until the day before canvass. So those go before the county board members as well. And so we will make the votes official during that county board meeting. Following that on November 15th, then we'll bring all of those results up to the state board for aggregation. We'll do an analysis of the reconciliation and the verification audits that the counties have done for me to present to the state board that we're certain about these results and we're ready for you to certify as well. And that meeting will take place on November the 26th. What's really important and gets at the heart of your question is that by law, those bipartisan board members have taken an oath to uphold North Carolina law and the Constitution. And in that law, it says they shall certify unless they are given strong justification. You know, the preponderance of evidence becomes a key phrase that would mean that they would have to overturn an election. We have had an overturned election in North Carolina. That was the first large election that I oversaw was a new election that was called in Congressional District 9. These are rare situations. And I think that might actually be the first in modern history that there's been a new congressional election held in our country. And it was right here in North Carolina. And it was because the evidence showed that there were issues around ballot harvesting. We've modified our laws to reduce the chance of that happening. And so I just want to emphasize that it's a very rare situation. So these board members, and traditionally they are unanimous and follow their oath, and they do certify the elections. In a rare case, in following 2022's election, we actually had 2 board members in Surrey County removed because they did not uphold their oath, and that was challenged. So we just want to emphasize that it is a very rare situation for them not to certify an election, and it's a very rare situation for there to be justification to do so. And when they don't, they may be in violation of their oath. So what we anticipate is unanimous agreement on November the 15th when those county boards meet, and unanimous agreement by the bipartisan state board members when they meet on November 26th. From there, we will send our results to the governor and the secretary of state, who take on their roles, which is for the governor to sign the certificates of ascertainment and for the secretary of state to conduct the electoral college. Everything else about North Carolina elections are conducted through the state board and the county boards of elections, but the secretary of state does have the role of conducting the electoral college.
I think that's really helpful to hear you kind of spell it out really from start to finish, and especially those couple of examples. One question I do want to come back to you on, Karen, is the idea of there kind of being legitimate points in the process for issues to be flagged, for candidates or third parties to come in and ask for another look at something, or for legal challenges even to come in, and kind of separating that out from kind of this point of certification, which, as you described, is a shall certify point in North Carolina law. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about kind of the legitimate legal avenues that folks might have if they do have any questions about North Carolina elections.
So just even in the way we do our work as election professionals, we are following very defined law methods. It's very systematic, very methodical. And so are the ways that people can challenge a voter, challenge the results, protest an election, file a lawsuit. And so we do have ongoing litigation. And so I'm limited on what I can say about some of that. But when we do have ongoing litigation, there is precedence quite often, and they are looking at the law and whether, is it a state law? Is it federal law? We do have federal law that we must abide by as well. And so, that also determines whether it's going to state court or federal court. And, in federal court, for sure, there's, I'll get really nerdy here. It's the Purcell principle, where, once an election's underway, you don't do something that alters course. So a lot of times there are lawsuits that may not be dealt with at this particular point in time and might be considered later. But I think, what we have to recognize is that there is the rule of law. And so even, it's not a willy-nilly process. Recounts, for example, we're very specific in our law as to who can call for a recount. If you're the 5th place finisher, sorry, you don't get to call for the recount if it's a, only a vote for one contest. And so the 2nd place finisher is generally the person who can call for a recount, because most of our contests are vote for one. And depending on whether it's a local contest or a state contest will determine the margin for which they can do that. Now, we've had close contests in North Carolina, and statewide contests like Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, which is one of our closest on record, was decided by 401 votes. If it's within 10,000 votes, then that 2nd place finisher can call for a recount. We'll rely on our machines to do a recount initially, and then there's margins that we look at to determine whether we move to a hand or eye or not. But I point all this out because that is very well defined within our laws and procedures about who can call for a recount, who can challenge another voter, who can challenge the results of an election.
I think that's all so important to know, that there are these legitimate avenues that exist. All right, I have one last question. I'll have this one for you, Sarah, and then we'll get into some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. Again, please do feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom. You can throw it in there and we will get to it if we have the time. Karen, of course, talked about recounts a lot. I believe you may have done one this spring. I'm wondering if you can kind of tell us more about kind of what that looks like for you on the ground and some of the work that you're doing.
When we do a recount, we really are putting hands on every ballot that was cast in an election. So we run every ballot back through a scanner and we tabulate the results. And we don't just do that in the back room by ourselves. These are board meetings. We publish them. They're open to the public. Our bipartisan board members oversee what we do. We actually bring in bipartisan teams of precinct officials to physically put the ballots into the scanner through this process. Recounts can take a long time, especially if counties don't have really high-speed scanners. If they're using some of the election day scanners, it can take time to get all those run back through. So recounts, I mean, I think it's legitimate that people can ask for them. We have seen some discrepancies in the past. It gives us an opportunity to look at that, where a voter maybe didn't mark a ballot very clearly, things like that. The board can take a look at those things and try to determine voter intent. But yeah, recounts are lengthy processes.
I'm sure. All right, so I think now we can go ahead and get into some of the questions that are coming into the Q&A box. So this first question we have is from Kurt at CNN. He asks if Director Brinson Bell can explain and respond to the legislative push today to require certain Western North Carolina counties to expand early voting sites. He asks if this is feasible and to what extent this might be a logistical challenge.
Thanks for that question, Kurt. We are having a lot of questions asked today of us as the legislature has come back to look at further relief efforts for the Helene affected counties. There is a bill or legislation that's proposed that would change up the number of early voting sites. There's a proposed ratio. I'm not certain where that is right now, as they are meeting as we are having this very press conference. So it's something that I would say definitely follow up with us on. But what we are very aware of is that the legislation that was passed in the Disaster Relief Act and the authorization that the state board gave in its emergency resolution was to say, let the local election offices decide. That's how we develop our early voting plans anyway. And so they know what facilities have been damaged. They know what facilities are available. Poll workers don't grow on trees, and they certainly don't when you're in a disaster situation where people may have been displaced. So, if this is what the legislature enacts, we will do what we have to do, because that is what the law, we follow the law. We administer elections based upon the law. But we are definitely trying to share with the legislators, and the local election officials are doing the same, that it could present challenges. What has happened thus far is that in most of these counties, we are seeing turnout that's on par or greater with 2020. So, we feel like the early voting sites that they've identified that are right for their counties are working.
I think it's really helpful to hear that, Aaron. And yeah, of course, things happening maybe quickly right now. We have one more question from Kurt. I'll just kind of keep going through these in the order that they come in. But this next question from Kurt, he says there's some rhetoric from a faction of political activists who are calling for people in the event that Trump loses in North Carolina to pressure the Republican legislative leadership to remedy an illegitimate election and essentially declare Trump the winner. Is it possible, legal for the legislature to essentially overturn election results?
So what's being proposed by these individuals is actually a violation of law. Much like I was describing earlier about what the certification process looks like, that's defined in state law. There's further instruction through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so when it comes to the presidential contest, our state boards and our county boards are to tally the votes and certify those results, and they are to send those to our governor and secretary of state to follow the electoral college process.
I think that makes complete sense. Appreciate you answering that. All right, we have one more question here. A reminder, please do, if you have any questions for this panel, throw them into the Q&A box and we can get to them in the order that they come in. This next question, I want to come to you, Sarah. Really right now, as Karen said, we're seeing record turnout across the state. I think last time I checked, and Karen can probably give us more up-to-date numbers than I have, something like 1.4 million voters have already cast their ballots. For those voters, can you tell us about where their ballots are now? What local election boards might be doing to prepare the ballots for tabulation on election day?
Certainly. So I can speak to my county. I think most counties probably have similar security practices. So early voting locations, they're accepting ballots every day. They're being scanned into a voting tabulator. Every day, those voted ballots are brought back to the Board of Elections office. So they are put in a secure envelope. They are sealed. They are signed by bipartisan officials that they pulled those ballots out together. Once they get back here, we in our building are fortunate we have a vault. So we store those in a vault. And to be quite frank, we don't have to do anything else with those ballots unless they're chosen for a sample audit count or a recount, because they have already been scanned into the voting machine. Same thing with the absentee ballots. So at each meeting, we are opening and scanning ballots. We're then putting them into a secure container, putting a security seal on them, putting them in our vault, and we won't look at those again until which point we maybe have to do a sample audit count on those ballots or a recount because they've already been scanned. So.
And Will, I'm happy to update you on the numbers. We're doing better than you think. This morning at 8 a.m., our count put us at over 2 million ballots having been cast in this election. That breaks down to about 1.9 million ballots have been cast during the early voting period. So in 1 week, 1.9 million North Carolinians have chosen to vote during the early voting period. And there's over 120,000 absentee by mail ballots that have been cast. In terms of early voting, we are outpacing where we were in 2020 when we had our largest use of early voting in North Carolina, early voting history. And it's proving again to be the most popular voting method of North Carolinians. We broke the first day of early voting record on Thursday of last week. We had over 350,000 individuals choose to vote that day. And in 2020, that was our standing record where we had over 340,000 individuals. So more than around 100,000 more people chose to vote on the first day of early voting for this particular election.
Wow, that's fantastic. And honestly, I should know better than to quote a number without coming to you first.
Well, but it gives me a chance to plug this.
Mhm.
We provide more data than any other state board of elections, and that is updated every day on our state board website, ncsbe.gov. There's other data that's available that gives a breakdown even by gender, by party breakdown, so forth. So definitely encourage folks to use that as a resource, and they can always reach out to our PIO. And I can put his information in the Q&A in case people need to follow up. He might actually rather I not have given that up because we're getting a lot of media requests as a battleground state and because of Helene, but he's doing a fantastic job and we're trying to be as responsive as we can.
Fantastic. Yeah. And thank you so much for doing this again. I think I have one last question that I'd like to ask both of you, and I'll maybe come to you first, Sarah, and then you, Karen. Unless there are other questions that folks want to throw into the Q&A box, please do feel free to do so now. But this question I want to ask both of you is just if there's anything else that you'd like to add in terms of why you're confident in the security of North Carolina's elections this year. Are there any other steps that you take that we haven't covered yet that maybe signal the number of checks and balances that we see in the work that you do?
I've got something. So I think it's important for everyone to know that what happens in Brunswick County should be very similar to what's happening in New Hanover County, in Buncombe County, in Wayne County, because we have uniform procedures about how we're supposed to reconcile these early voting locations, about how our board meetings go when we're looking at absentee ballots. What is an acceptable absentee ballot? What is not an acceptable absentee ballot? And so really things should be happening the same in every county in North Carolina. And almost all of our processes when we are dealing with ballots are open to the public. They're done in the presence of our bipartisan board. So if someone's curious, wants to know how we do things, come watch, come join us. We love to have people at our board meetings.
I think that's a really helpful reminder. Yeah. Karen, over to you. Anything that you would add that's is kind of important for people to know about North Carolina elections, the work you do, your checks and balances?
I think Sarah's hit on a lot of those points. One other point that we often try to make sure we emphasize is that there is a paper trail. So we use technology for efficiency, and it's proven to be accurate as well. In a world where we want instant results, having tabulators in our polling places, having software that can help us to aggregate, having tested all of those systems for accuracy, that's how we're able to push out results in a timely fashion. But that there is a paper trail to everything that we do. And so those paper ballots that are used in North Carolina are the way that we can always prove the accuracy of the technology in counting those.
All right. So it looks like we do have a couple more questions that are coming in. And I'd love to kind of stick with you here, Karen, for those. The first one is from Sarah, who asks, do you happen to know how many Western North Carolina counties impacted by Helene meet the one early voting site per 30,000 registered voter threshold as outlined in today's proposed legislation?
We have been looking at those numbers, and I know that there's been a conversation around whether it's a 30,000 to 1 or 40,000 to 1. I believe if it's 30,000 to 1, then there are two counties that would be affected, Henderson and McDowell. And if it's 40,000 to 1, then I think it's just Henderson that would be affected.
Got it. All right, and we have one more question here, and it is from Ben. And maybe, Sarah, if I can start with you and then maybe give you the chance also, Karen, just because I know you're doing so much work on the ground. Karen indicated the new ID rules could lead to a jump in provisionals. What's been the experience for you during early voting? Do you feel like messages have been received around new rules? Are you seeing voters assumingly with their IDs coming in?
I do. I think we have had in Brunswick County very few provisionals because someone did not come with an acceptable form of identification. We've also recently seen an, excuse me, an uptick of people coming into our office to get the free photo ID that voters can get if they don't have an acceptable form. So I think the message is being received. I'm hopeful that it continues that way through election day. But I do think that people are aware that they need to provide acceptable ID to vote.
And
Yeah, Karen, anything you'd add?
yeah, I'll just add, we get a lot of questions around, why we offer an exception form, why there are so many acceptable forms of ID. And that is us implementing the law that was passed in North Carolina. And so we encourage folks to go to bringitnc.gov, bringitnc.gov, and learn more information about the many options there are for voting with the various IDs that are acceptable. Most will vote with a driver's license, but they can certainly use veterans ID, military ID, there are tribal IDs, there's university IDs. It could even be a passport. So there's a lot of options there. But then that exception form is provided by law that someone may not have had their ID with them, and they can indicate that and bring that to the County Board of Elections during the certification period. Or we have the option for them to indicate that they have a religious objection to being photographed, and that's why they do not have an acceptable form of ID. We have already in place, not knowing that we would be faced with Helene, there's a provision on the exception form that you've been affected by a natural disaster in the last 100 days. So we may see some North Carolinians need that in the western part of the state. And then there's also the reasonable impediment. And that could be they were not able to, they didn't have adequate transportation to go and get an ID, or they had a conflict with their work or school schedule. All of these provisions on this exception form were passed by our legislature and put into effect as law. And so we're making sure to implement that. But we've seen pretty good success in the primary and even during the early voting period. So what we want people to really take away from that, though, is, come and vote. And we will work with you to make sure that your vote counts.
I think that is a really good note to end on right there, especially when we're talking about all the work that you're doing, all the checks and balances that are really throughout the entire process. Come and vote. These folks will help you out. I think want to respect everybody's time here. I know that it is a very busy part of the year for everybody who's joining us and speaking today. So thank you again, Karen, and thank you again, Sarah, and thank you, Chandra, for taking the time today. Thank you, everybody who joined us here. If you do have any questions, if you have any follow-ups, if we can help out with anything, feel free to send us a note, and we're happy to get you some answers. Hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.